Jerusalem, the Contested City. Lecture 12. Travelers, Tourists, and Pilgrims.
In the last lecture, I described how the quality of European pilgrims to the Holy Land and Jerusalem was changing in the 15th century, the end of the 15th century, that the humanism that had been growing in Europe, the beginnings of the Reformation, all of this time of upheaval was changing the perceptions that pilgrims brought with them to the Holy Land. But there were changes inside of Palestine and Jerusalem itself during this period. The Mamluks had ruled Palestine and Jerusalem from Cairo, that was their capital, from about 1250. And in 1516, a new force appeared on the Islamic scene, the Ottoman Turks. The Ottomans were a family of Turks from Central Asia who had gradually spread out across the face of Islam and carved themselves out an enormous swathe of Islamic lands, and finally confronted the Mamluks in Egypt in 1516, defeated them, and included Egypt and Palestine into this new Ottoman Empire. The same Ottoman Empire that eventually extended up and finally took Constantinople away from the Christians in 1453, even before they got Egypt, and eventually went up into the Balkans, and at one point in the 16th century were at the gates of Vienna. So that there was this was an enormous Ottoman power, and part of their empire was the province of Philistine and the city of Al-Quds, or Al-Quds, the Holy One, or Jerusalem. And like other dynasties that came to Jerusalem, one of the first impulses on the part of the Ottomans was to invest money in the city and to demonstrate their piety, to demonstrate their orthodoxy, to demonstrate their devotion to certainly the third holiest city in Islam. The first city of all, of course, was Mecca, and then second ranked Medina, and third was Jerusalem. And this was sort of the protocol order of holiness among cities from the Islamic point of view. And so the Ottomans endowed places in all three. But what interests us is particularly is Jerusalem. And what the Ottomans did, among other useful things initially, was to do something about the urban infrastructure of Jerusalem, and particularly the water supply. The water of Jerusalem is generally supplied from rainwater, which is collected in cisterns throughout the city. It doesn't have any underground. It has one underground source of water, the Gihon Spring, which we saw very early on. Otherwise, it's mostly rainwater. But the Ottomans attempted to bring in water from a distance from other springs and to collect it in large reservoirs outside the city so that there would be a steadier supply of water. And they also built new monuments, not around the Haram so much. The Mamluks had done that. They had ringed the Haram with madrasas and Sufi convents, as we've seen. The Ottomans concentrated on the Haram itself and put up a little monument here, a little monument there. In fact, the whole top of the Haram was becoming crowded with these little memorials, these little chapels. It was a rather rural-looking place, the top of the Haram. Today, it is almost entirely paved. There are still some unpaved parts with grass in it, and there may even be a tree or two. But in the earlier period, in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, it was park-like atop the Haram. There were lots of trees and lots of grass and greenage up there. At any rate, the Ottomans then brought a kind of new blood, new prosperity to Jerusalem. But it didn't last terribly long. That in the 17th century, the signs of decline are palpable everywhere in Jerusalem. And one of the things that is possible to do now is to trace precisely the trajectory of the economic and social life of the city, because starting in the 17th century, we begin to have archives of Jerusalem, archives of the Islamic world in general, that up to this point one has to try to figure out the history of these places from literary histories. We have historians writing about the places, but we have no documentation. But in the 16th, and much more so in the 17th century, we begin to have records, actual documentary records, of municipal courts, of tax registers, of census rolls, etc., so that the history of the Middle East, the history of Palestine, the history of Jerusalem, gets a much more solid kind of profile. And as I say, it is not an encouraging picture. The population of Jerusalem, generally speaking, goes into decline. The numbers begin to decline. At one point, at its low point, there are only 3,000 residents in the whole city of Jerusalem. We're talking about always here about the old city, within the walls. Speaking of the walls, one thing the Turks did do, the Ottomans did do, was they re-walled the city. They entirely redid the city. So between 1537 and 1541, the Ottomans constructed the walls which today surround the old city of Jerusalem, so that when a visitor to Jerusalem goes to the old city today, what he sees and what he or she walks through, the gates they walk through, is the other gates of the Ottoman walled city. But as I say, the city was going into progressive decline, and part of it had to do with Ottoman administration. The Ottoman governors who passed through Jerusalem usually had a very short tenancy, and so the idea was, as happened in the Roman Empire too, that when you have these rotating governors, the idea is to drain as much out of your appointment as you can. You're only going to be there for a very short period of time to take the money and run, so to speak. Or in these cases, take the money and saunter. There was no need to run because nobody would be pursuing you. And the only way of getting money out of Jerusalem had no other trade or traffic except essentially the European pilgrimage trade. Muslims passed through there quite rarely, but not in any great numbers. And Eastern Christians generally were poorer and not nearly so frequent. So the real trade was in these European pilgrims. And so the Ottoman government had two ways of extracting money from this. One was to try to extort it from the resident Christian communities in Jerusalem, to make them pay for their privileges, and to switch privileges, to take it away from the Greeks and to give it to the Armenians, to give a church or privilege, take it away from one and give it to the other, and charge money in the process, and then repeat the process every 25 years or so. Or, that's one way of extorting it from the permanent Christian communities there. And the other was to take it out in fees from the pilgrims, the transients. Oh, the permanent Christians and the transient Christians were essentially the chief source of income for this Ottoman administration, and it was not large, and it was getting ever smaller because the pilgrimage trade was beginning to fall off. A combination of skepticism about the holy places, the Reformation, the Ottoman power in the Mediterranean. The Ottomans, unlike earlier Muslims, the Ottomans were a sea power and dominated a lot of the eastern Mediterranean, where once Venetian ships could safely sail from Venice to Jaffa, no longer. Right? The Ottomans controlled all of those islands and controlled the sea, and so sea voyages were very, very problematic, and that bit into the pilgrimage trade to Jerusalem. Among the people who did come to Jerusalem, and in somewhat increasing numbers, were Jews. Jews coming from Europe, and mostly from Eastern Europe, from Poland and the eastern parts of Germany, the Ukraine. Jews were beginning to come to Jerusalem, some to visit, others to stay. It was always a dream. Almost from the beginning, Jews indulged in the practice of reinterment in Palestine, in Eretz Israel, in the Holy Land, because this was sacred territory, and so in death, perhaps one could find one's final resting place there. And so that reinterment had gone on, but that more and more people were also contemplating the possibility of living there. Now, when Zionism took hold in the 19th century, there was a program for going and living there and making these communities self-supporting by agriculture. It wasn't a terribly religious sort of ideal that moved the Zionists of the 19th century. They had more practical social ideals and economic ideals. But when a Jew was thinking of moving to Jerusalem in the 17th century, the 18th century, this was really an act of piety, and the only way those communities could survive there, the Jews could survive in Jerusalem, was essentially by being supported from the outside, by getting other funds. In fact, all of the outside communities, all of these Greeks, Armenians, Latins, Franciscans, all these monks, all these nuns, all these clerics, all these rabbis and their followers had to be supported from the outside. Without that, they would never have been able to survive. They had no source of income. They got something from the Pilgrims, but that was hardly enough for the support of these churches, which began to slowly fall into disrepair. So not only did the whole structure of the city begin to crumble, but also the structure of the holy places. Some of these things that went back as far as Constantine, the Christian ones, and there were no Jewish constructions because you couldn't build new places, right? You couldn't build new synagogues, and so Jews had to worship as best they could, simply, as we will see, mostly at the Western Wall, just by standing in the shadow of the temple platform. But it were interesting times for the Jews, and one of the things that made it interesting is the arrival of somebody called David Rueveni. Right? Rueveni is really Reuben. I mean, it's the tribe of Reuben to anglicize it. And Rueveni showed up in Jerusalem in the summer of 1523, and shortly after the Ottoman takeover, therefore, and announced that he was a representative of an Eastern kingdom, Eastern Jewish kingdom, that was composed of the lost 10 tribes. You recall from an earlier lecture that when the Assyrians came down like a wolf on the fold in the 700s, in 722, they carried off a large part of the population of northern Israel into some kind of mysterious exile, and that when the dust cleared, 10 of the original 12 tribes of Israel had disappeared without a trace. And so said David Rueveni, he was a representative. They had settled somewhere. They had established a kingdom, and he was their representative. And he was on the way to Italy on his mission. And in Jerusalem, he went up to the Temple Mount, and there in the Dome of the Rock, which was the site of the temple, which was identified by Jews as the site of the temple, he announced that he was the Messiah. And according to the account, the Muslim guards fell to their knees and said, "How may we serve you?" These stories all come from Jewish sources, contemporary Jewish sources who describe this thing. Whether or not those guards fell on their feet, some money may have exchanged hands, and they may have chosen to ignore him because they had been paid to. One is always suspicious when something like that happens, in the case, especially in this era, that some sort of money has passed hands. Anyway, they thought he was more curious than dangerous, and they must have said the equivalent of the Ottoman "sure," right? And let him go. He went to Italy, and where he was received by the Pope, and he announced his plan, which was for an alliance between the kingdom of the 10 tribes and the Catholic Church. They would unite in a coalition against the Ottoman Turks and defeat them. And the Pope listened patiently and didn't exactly sign on. He said, "I guess we'll appoint a commission to study this." And so David Rueveni went on and ended up in Portugal, where he seems to have died in 1538, either in the prison of the Portuguese Inquisition or, as some more lurid accounts suggest, in an auto da fe. Auto da fe being a Iberian art form where you burn people for heresy. So the likes of David Rueveni certainly lit up the landscape in Jerusalem for a while. But they were one of the more interesting things is the arrival of Jewish immigrants in the city with their expectations and their advice, what they should bring by way of clothes and how to take care of lodging. They were told that they shouldn't expect any help from the local community because the local community was even poorer than they were. But they came, some of them in large numbers. There was a group that came in its thousands in the year 1700. A rabbi named Judah the Pious led this group of Eastern Jews to Jerusalem. See, some of them were prompted by millennial hopes, I think, that these things, occasionally they would sweep through Europe, particularly following some sort of pogrom or persecution, an expectation that the end of days was arriving. It is millennial hopes spring, one of the places out of which they spring are a kind of utter despair. So if the millennium was arriving, that was one of the things that would drive Jews to try to go to the Holy Land, which would certainly be the end point of any sort of millennial event, and to prepare there. So the population of Jerusalem Jewish population of Jerusalem, probably began to increase slightly. Right? That's the impression. The Christians in Jerusalem were, as I say, last time we saw a good deal about the pilgrimage process. But one particular devotion has a Christian devotion in Jerusalem has a rather curious history, and this is the one called the Way of the Cross. The Way of the Cross refers to the path that Jesus took across Jerusalem from the time he was condemned by Pilate to the time he was he was crucified. And Christians had fairly early on identified the places along the way, that he stopped here, and he saw his mother here, he fell under his cross here, this place, Simon of Cyrene, was made to carry his cross in his place. All of these taking events out of the Gospels and out of legend and sort of stringing together, marking the places across Jerusalem, so that fairly early on, the Christians must have known about this path and this Via Dolorosa, as it came to be called, or painful way across Jerusalem. And we are told that the Franciscans used to do this on Good Friday, or sometimes every Friday of the year. The Franciscans would go out 2 by 2 in their bare feet and trace the path of Jesus across Jerusalem and say prayers at the appropriate places and meditate on the events. Now, all of this must have been done very quietly. And it was public, clearly, but it must have been quietly done, because one of the things about the Muslim administration of any Christian or Jewish population is they shouldn't make a public display of their religion. So public processions of the type that later developed in this Way of the Cross, and which are conducted today in Jerusalem, would be out of the question during most of this period. So the Way of the Cross that is celebrated today in Jerusalem on Good Friday, with pilgrims crossing Jerusalem, many of them, one of them at least, carrying a replica of the cross of Jesus and stopping along the way and saying prayers, and it's very public, is something re-imported back into Jerusalem from Europe. Because what happened is that once the Franciscans began to do this in Jerusalem, they began to do it as well in Europe, that the Franciscan devotion to this Way of the Cross began to catch on in Europe, and the Franciscans would build along roads in open places sort of replicas, sort of small models of representing these sites along the way, along the Jerusalem Way, the so-called stations of the cross, of the Way of the Cross. And that, so that the devotion began to spread in Europe, and that most of these places were simply kind of stylized memorials of the places in Jerusalem. And sometimes they end up inside of churches eventually with the same kinds of blessings attached to them as simply markers with Roman numerals on them, 1 to 14. There were 14 of these stations. But the Franciscans went a step further, and it's a way in which Christianity had in a way of expropriating Jerusalem, of carrying Jerusalem back to Europe. They couldn't have it themselves in the city, and they were inhibited in their liturgical celebrations inside the city. But they weren't inhibited in Europe, and so if they couldn't go to Jerusalem, they could certainly bring Jerusalem to Europe, which they did with a vengeance in some places, and most famously, I guess, in a place called Varallo in northern Italy. A Franciscan in 1486 built there a scale model on the side of Mount Verna, a scale model of not only scenes from the life of Jesus, but almost all of biblical history, that this this way up the mountain starts with a little chapel in which the person going there can look in and see the original sin, can see Adam and Eve in Eden, appropriately fig-leafed and with the serpent on the tree. All of this in life-size, right, models, realistic models, and each housed in its own chapel. So this is a little tableau vivant that you look in and you see the scene. You proceed on next, and eventually further up the hill are the scenes from the life of Jesus, including a sumptuous Last Supper, which is where the table, there's Jesus sitting in the midst of his disciples, all life-size, all wearing authentic clothing, all with beards and makeup, and look, this is like Madame Tussauds Wax Museum, except on an extraordinarily large scale. And on the way up, and the final stop is the basilica at the top of the hill of the Assumption, Mary being taken bodily into heaven, the last event in this scenario. That was so popular, and the Stations of the Cross became so popular that it was duplicated in other places, and there was a version of this at Braga in Portugal, same sort of scale model sort of thing, and then another one at Mont Valérien outside of Paris, and then eventually even in the United States, that in Waterbury, Connecticut, there was constructed in the 1950s a place called Holy Land, USA. And what it is a kind of theme park of the last days of Jesus in Jerusalem, with the models not done nearly so carefully or nearly so authentically or nearly so realistically, I should say, as the Monte Varallo, which are really quite extraordinary. More like approximations, let us say. And so this is as I say, a way of expropriating Jerusalem, bringing Jerusalem to Europe and eventually the New World if Christians couldn't get to Jerusalem. And technically the way this was achieved is that the church, as the guardian of the merits of Jesus' death on the cross, could simply transfer blessings. That is to say, if you performed a certain liturgical act in Jerusalem, if you visited one of these holy places, there were attached to it these blessings, which I've already described as indulgences. And the Pope simply transferred the indulgences that were attached to making the Stations of the Cross in Jerusalem to performing the same act in any church in Christendom. So it's a way of transferring the ritual, transferring the benefits, at least, of the ritual from one place to the other. The final thing that should be noted about the transformation that's going on here in Jerusalem under the Ottomans, and this has nothing to do with the Ottomans, it has to do with something that's going on in Europe, is the arrival in Jerusalem of the Reformation, or to be more accurate, the arrival of reformers, of Protestants in Jerusalem. The business of pilgrimage was declining, as I said, because of the naval situation in the Mediterranean, the rise of the Ottoman sea power. But those who made it through, show now a very distinct kind of difference from their predecessors, and particularly notable are the Protestants, and they too have left behind accounts of their pilgrimage, and the tone in them is quite different because a number of things have happened. The Enlightenment, the European Enlightenment has taken place. There is a great deal of skepticism now, either on intellectual grounds or even on religious grounds among the reformers, on this matter of holy places and of miracles. And so when these pilgrims are now beginning to be travelers, right? There are still pious motives involved. These Protestants are coming to see the Holy Land, to see the land associated with the life and death of Jesus. But where the skepticism begins to set in, that this is undoubtedly the place where these things occurred, but what is skeptical now is that are these the sites where exactly this happened? So there is a great deal of skepticism about that. But there are other social problems as well. As we've seen a number of times, the monopoly on Western pilgrims to Jerusalem was put in the hands of the Franciscans. That's when there were only Catholic visitors to Jerusalem. But now there are non-Catholics arriving, and the way the Muslim authorities have worked this out is that all the pilgrims will be the responsibility of the Franciscans. All these Europeans are the responsibilities of the Franciscans. But these new Protestant arrivals in no sense wanted to be the responsibility of the Franciscans, and certainly didn't want to spend the night with the monks. And they tried a number of ploys, one of which was to try the Greek Orthodox, that they were, I guess the enemies of Rome would be the friends that would be their friends, and so there were some sort of attempt to make arrangements with the Greek Orthodox, which didn't always work out happily. Even less happily was the protestations on the sum that they would rather spend the night with the Turks than with the Franciscans. Well, that's a brave sentiment in Europe, where some of the reformers said they preferred the turban of the Sultan to the tiara of the Pope. Well, that's a political statement, but to prefer to spend the night with the Turks in Jerusalem rather than the Franciscans is a somewhat more dicey proposition, as some of them quickly discovered. But it was an unpleasant experience, this confrontation with the Catholicism of the European Christian experience in Jerusalem. Greeks coming there and Armenians coming there, Copts coming there, lived in their own communities and went to their own holy places and never had to confront this kind of thing. But for European, inevitably, it meant some sort of coming to terms with the monkish quality of the place and the Catholic quality of the European custodianship of the holy sites. And one of the results of this, one of the outcomes, eventually there were Protestants living, there was a Protestant presence in the city. And so particularly once the consulates began to set up there, American and British consulates set up there, then there is a Protestant population, and so Protestant visitors can come and stay with secular types and not have to stay with the Franciscans. But there's still the question of the holy place and holy places. And two of them in particular, the two chief holy places, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem and the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, struck the Protestants as they had doubts about authenticity, but they had probably even stronger feelings about the aesthetics of the whole operation there. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre in particular many of them found it an extraordinary kind of turn-off. Not only the presence of these monks with whom, Protestantism had gotten itself rid of all of that, they thought. And here in the holiest place in Christendom was a place that was filled with monks, and filled with incense, and filled with statues, and filled with decorations of the most execrable type in their eyes. To this day, many visitors to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre have somewhat the same impression. It's a wildly Baroque place in its decor. So what eventually happened, to move anticipate a little bit in the story, is that Protestants ended up worshiping in other places which they found more suitable, and could tell themselves perhaps that they were somewhat more authentic, though clearly they are not more authentic. One is the famous Garden Tomb. The Garden Tomb is an ancient tomb that was discovered just outside the Damascus Gate, north of the city. It's a tomb which is still kept in a kind of rustic way. It's still a garden, and it looks like the kind of tomb in which Jesus should have been buried, not that thing inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So Protestants tend to celebrate their feast of Easter at the Garden Tomb, and in Bethlehem they prefer not to go to midnight mass, this papist celebration in the Church of St. Catherine of the Nativity, but in something called Shepherd's Field, a place outside the town of Bethlehem.
This ends Lecture 12. This ends Lecture 12. This ends Lecture 12. This ends